I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our members, to the panelists, to our guests that are joining us for the 67th Annual Conference of the Middle East Institute. I'm sure today is going to prove to be a very engaging day. We have some terrific panels, 4 terrific panels lined up today, and a very special luncheon. But it's going to be very good because of the quality of the panelists, but also the interest of the issues that have been going on in the Middle East over this past year. You know, in looking back over 2013, it's now clear that this year was the year for transition. Those heady promises of Tahrir Square and of revolution and excitement of revolution have given way to the realities and the difficulties of governance and of creating institutions for inclusive democracy. It's not easy, is the lesson of 2013. So today we pause, we take stock of the events over the past year, and we look forward to the future as our panelists identify trends that are going to impact those of us in the United States and the people in the countries of the region. We've assembled a terrific team of panelists, including many experts who are from Washington, D.C., but we've made a point, and the Middle East Institute makes a point of bringing people, flying people in from the region who know their country, know their culture, know their issues, they live with it, and they bring fresh perspectives to Washington, because we believe that is very important for our decision makers and opinion leaders to hear, are the fresh perspectives, the authentic voices from the region. So it's our pleasure to welcome all of them today. The mission of the Middle East Institute is to provide nonpartisan expert analysis and information to the public about the region in the Middle East. And that's why we make this conference absolutely free, no charge to the public and to the media. We want to attract as many people as we possibly can to hear these authentic voices that we've flown in from the region. But we're a membership organization, and to continue to be able to provide this public service, we need the support of our members and our donors and of you. So I'd like to encourage you, if you're not a member, although I see many members with us today, the membership desk is right outside the door. On coffee break, I would encourage you to go, and for $100 you can become a basic member of the Middle East Institute, and for that you get a subscription to the Middle East Journal, which is one of the most highly regarded peer-reviewed academic journals on the Middle East in the English language out there. So today's the day. It's a great day to show your appreciation for all that the Middle East Institute does. I'm going to say this too, because it's not just supporting what we've been doing. It's also your contributions support what our vision is to do. And the vision for the Middle East Institute is to create a center here in the nation's capital that will promote Middle Eastern culture, that will continue our academic work with our library and our language and our publications and our website with rich content. But a third pillar is to create the Middle East Institute as a center for promoting Arab and Middle Eastern culture. So please help us do that. Part of our push to establish the Middle East Institute, upgrade the Middle East Institute as a competitive think tank in D.C., is the recent Paul Salem, who has recently joined us to head that effort. He's now our Vice President for Policy and Research for the Policy Institute at the Middle East Institute, and he will be moderating today's first panel. Paul, prior to joining the Middle East Institute, Dr. Salem was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut from 2006 to 2013. From 1999 to 2006, He was director of the Ferris Foundation in Beirut. And in 1989, he founded and directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, which is Lebanon's leading public policy think tank. In 2002, Dr. Salem served on the Senior Review Committee of the UNDP Arab Human Development Report. Dr. Salem writes regularly in Arab and the Western press. He's published in numerous journals and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Foreign Affairs, National Interest, Financial Times. He got his undergraduate and graduate and his PhD from Harvard University. He's author of so many books, I'm not going to mention them all, and so many reports that I encourage you to go online and read them. And he will now introduce our first panelists. Thank you. Paul?
Thank you, Wendy, very much. And certainly commend Ambassador Chamberlain for the leadership she has shown taking the Middle East Institute to where it is today. Really a force for understanding of the Middle East, a force for understanding the policy challenges in the region in a new way. And I'm really thrilled to be part of this very exciting MEI team at this very challenging time, certainly for the Middle East and perhaps for U.S. Middle East relations. The conference today and the panel, I would say, is very timely. We're almost 3 years since the first uprisings in Tunisia in December of 2010. In the past few years, the ground has shifted in the Arab world, a major sea change in political opinion, political engagement, political aspirations, political values, new connections between citizens and other citizens, new ways of organization, new approaches to linking social and economic issues to political demands. Certainly a historic time of change in the Arab world. The mood that was unleashed by the uprisings in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Libya, then Yemen, and Syria, and so on, really affected every country in the Arab world, from Morocco all the way to Oman. Not all of them had full uprisings or changed leaders or regimes, but really has led to a new era in Arab politics, where I would say citizen engagement is now something that will not regress, that will not go backwards. Citizen empowerment is now part of the new reality. Demands for accountable government, demands for better government, more transparency, more social justice, more dignity and freedom for citizens has become part of the landscape in the Middle East, even if the road is very, very troubled, even if in some cases there is serious pushback, but it is the beginning of a very fundamental process in the Arab world. We have with us today an excellent panel to discuss two of the prominent cases of change in the last 3 years. These are the cases of Tunis and Egypt. Tunis appears to be sort of the most optimistic of the cases of Arab change, but it too is facing serious questions, serious challenges. In Egypt, we've all been following the ups and downs, the to's and fro's of politics in Egypt in the last 2.5 years. Other significant countries not represented on this panel, but perhaps are part of discussions that could take place in other panels today. Certainly Libya and Yemen, also cases that have thrown off authoritarian rulers, but are in different states of disarray or challenge vis-a-vis actually transitioning to something functional. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and we're very honored and lucky to have them. Very expert opinion on the cases and countries we're talking about. And I will start in the order that they will be making their initial I will be asking them my initial questions in this order. We have with us from Tunisia Dr. Noureddine Jebnoun to my immediate left. Dr. Jebnoun is a faculty member at Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. His focus is on governance and security challenges of the Arab Middle East and North Africa. He also taught previously at the University of Montana and in Tunis at the Tunisian War College and the Tunisian Command and General Staff College, as well as the Tunisian National Defense Institute. He left Tunisia in 2005 and has been a prolific author and commentator on not only Tunisian affairs, but also Libyan affairs in great detail, and the questions of Arab authoritarianism and Arab change. And we're very happy to have you, Noureddine, with us today. Then we will be turning to my colleague at MEI, a senior scholar at MEI, Dr. Khalil Anani, an Egyptian scholar, an expert on Islamist movements in Egypt and the Arab world in general, and has written also on elections and democratization in the Arab world. He joined MEI recently. He was previously at Durham University and also a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. In Egypt, he's been a senior scholar at the Ahram Foundation, the Ahram Institute in Cairo. He writes regularly in the Egyptian and the Arab press and is the author of a number of books in Arabic and English on the Muslim Brotherhood, on elections in the Middle East, on political Islam and its past, present, and future, and a frequent commentator on Arab and Western media. We will then turn to Dr. Rabab al-Mahdi, who has flown in, and we thank her for that, from Cairo. Rabab is an associate professor of political science at the American University of Cairo. She is also an activist and an actor in the Egyptian political scene. She earned her PhD from McGill University and has worked and done her research on comparative political economy with a focus on the Middle East and Latin America. She's done a lot of research on state-civil society relations and social movements and their connection to political change. She is also the author. She's a regular contributor in the Egyptian press in particular, and people very much follow her column in Shuruk newspaper, and has also authored a number of books and reports on the Arab Spring in Egypt, on workers and youth, on women and issues of that nature. And we're very, very happy that she's with us today. Dr. Larry Diamond is probably very well known to most of you, a renowned scholar on issues of democratization and transition globally. Dr. Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University, and there he directs the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's the founding co-director of the influential Journal of Democracy and is a senior consultant at the National Endowment for Democracy. Dr. Diamond has edited or co-edited or authored over 36 books. The list is very, very long. Books on trends of democratization in Asia, in Latin America, globally, and in the Arab world, connections between religion and democracy, and so on. And we're also very honored that he made his way to D.C. to be with us today. So let me start with Dr. Jebnoun and to delve right into the case of Tunisia, the first country which sort of started this process of uprising and troubled transition. Noureddine, I hope if you can sort of get us up to speed as to we've all been following the troubling events of the last year, the assassinations that took place, the immense polarization in the Tunisian body politic, and then leading to a hopeful moment when there was an agreement, partly pushed by the General Federation of the Labor Unions, to get the political parties to agree to a roadmap. And we're sort of in the middle of that now, supposedly an agreement to agree on a prime minister, for the government to resign and move forward in a political way without further violence. And yet that has been troubled even in the last few days as we follow the press. So, Dr. Jebnoun, if you could give your analysis of where we stand in Tunisia and what are the challenges immediately ahead. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. As you pointed out, the situation, I think, in Tunisia is not good, but by regional standards is better than Libya and better than Egypt. So the problem with this famous roadmap drafted by the famous quartet and seeking to push the government to resign and then to have what they call like a government of technocrats or independent, which will be able to move the country forward to prepare like the legislative and presidential elections. I think it's, from Tunisian perspective, this national dialogue could be identified to more like a kind of struggle over power between the so-called Islamist and the non-Islamist. I don't want to use like secularist because, you know, the concept of secularism or even neoliberalism in their word is different from here. It's really a struggle over power. Ennahda is trying to buy time, to stay in power, and to secure its exit and to be able in the future to get back to the power through elections. The non-Islamists also, they want to get to power. They failed to mobilize in 2011, and they went through this national dialogue to get to power. And let me say something. In the aftermath of the coup in Egypt, the non-Islamists started calling the Tunisian army to stage a coup against an elected government, whether we like it or not. It's a legitimate government, came through box rather than ballot. And those same leaders, non-Islamists today, are involved in this dialogue. But the main goal is not like to move the country from this political stalemate. The main goal is to substitute to the Nahda. Meantime, I think Nahda made mistakes, among them I will say, the strength to control the Tunisian administration, the infiltration of the Tunisian administration, the appropriation of those bureaucratic positions. I can give you an example. Among the 24 governors running 24 regions, 18 governors now are affiliated or sympathizer of Ennahda. So Ennahda has this obsession, or what I call I will say this obsession towards security. You know, the movement was oppressed under Ben Ali, and the assessment of the movement, if they leave power now, maybe they will be marginalized or even they will be suppressed and excluded, mainly that the old guard or the old dinosaur like Sebsi is coming back with the old remnant of the regime, and it's Nida Tunis now is the party able to mobilize on the ground and able to rivalize with Ennahda.
Could you shed a bit light on the role of the trade union federation, civil society, women's movement? It's a very vibrant movement in Tunisia, and in a sense, one gets maybe from a distance a sense that the labor unions, civil society, and so on was the force that helped create change in so far still a peaceful manner, whereas perhaps in Egypt it was the military and so on that acted. What more could you tell us about that role of civil society and the labor unions?
As you pointed out, civil society in Tunisia is vibrant one, and the labor union played a very important role, which was created in 1946 in the national struggle against France. As we say in Tunisia, the FLN in Algeria has like its army, but the Tunisian army was like the labor union against the French at this time. So, nonetheless, the top leader of this labor union was co-opted by the former regime, by Ben Ali, and those who were able to mobilize the mass demonstrations in January 2011, December 2010, January 2011, were those leaders at the local and regional level. As the top leader, as I said, they were co-opted and disconnected from the reality the socio-economic reality of the country. So in the aftermath of the uprising, when Ben Ali fled the country, the labor union played a very important role in like what we call like the sit-ins, the strikes across the country. But meantime, it was sometimes a kind of reckless role as they tried, for example, to increase the number of workers within the public sector, to keep like the subsidies, to undermine the government through like national strikes. Meantime, I think now they're playing a very important role in those negotiations, but the risk is as you know, the labor union is leaning left organization, and the risk that the leadership could be manipulated by the opposition, and if the opposition succeed in manipulating the labor union, I will say they will quick like they will speed like the resignation of the current government. Another element about the civil society, as you know, a new law drafted in 2011, and this law encouraged and is encouraging like civil society to comment on the situation, to testify, and to help the government to take into consideration the socio-economic issue. But the problem today is civil society is divided, is polarized, and this polarization is the consequence of the division within the political elite between the Islamist and the non-Islamist. Even within the Islamist, you have a kind of competition between Nahda and the conservative Salafist. As you know, the Salafist, you have the scholarly or scientific Salafist, you have the revival Salafist, you have a fringe minority, what we call like the jihadi or violent Salafist. So this competition, intra-Islamist competition, is about to get the most or the ultra-conservative vote for the next elections. Another element, if you allow me to emphasize, is about like the absence of any reform when it comes to security sector in Tunisia. And you cannot like move forward this transition without a genuine reform of security sector. We inherited the infamous State Security Service and also the political police, which was involved in repressing and collecting intelligence on Ben Ali's opponents. They dismantled those two organizations, but we don't have any idea what they did with, the personnel within those two organizations. The police custody system still the same, the torture still a practice within the Tunisian security forces. For example, on November 1st, one drug dealer was killed, just tortured and killed 30 minutes after he was apprehended by the police. The judiciary system also needs reform. You have magistrate and judges who are corrupted in Tunisia. So I think civil society could play a very important role when it comes to those two elements, reforming security system and reforming also the judiciary system.
Thank you very much, Noureddine. We will be coming back to Tunisia, but let me move on to my colleague, Dr. Anani. Khalil, if you may, you're very expert on the Islamist movements. There was a Nahda in Tunisia, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There were similarities, there were differences, difference in their history, but also a different approach perhaps in government and how they responded to protests and crises, and perhaps in their vision moving forward. What's your view of, if we looked at the Nahda, we looked at the Egyptian MB, how would you analyze how they approached the revolutions, government, and then the crises they both faced?
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Well, Noureddine did not give me any chance to be optimistic about Egypt after what he said about Tunis. I try to be optimistic in my talk. Well, I think there are a few differences between Al-Nahda and between the Muslim Brotherhood. On the one hand, there is no Ghanouchi in Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which means that there is no strong reformist trend within the Muslim Brotherhood. The movement has been under the control and domination of the conservative wing, I would say, since 1995, I would say, under Mustafa Mashhour and then Mamoun al-Hudaybi and then Mahdi Akif, and then the current general guide, which is Mohammed Badir. So over the last 2 decades, I would say the Muslim Brotherhood has been under the strong domination of the most conservative. And by conservative, I mean that those who are less pragmatic, less progressive in their views and visions, at the same time also less compromising when it comes to working with different ideological forces like secular and liberals. This is the first difference. The second one is that Ghanouchi, to a large extent, has more long-term vision about the future of Islamism in Tunis, for instance. But when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, they, over the last, I would say, 3 years, they were very short-sighted. The main goal of the Brotherhood over the last 3 years was how to get or grab as much power as they can. It's not the case with the Nahda. If you remember, since the elections in Tunis, Nahda agreed to form a coalition government, comparing to the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, they tried to reach out to secular and liberal forces, but they did not give much, I would say, ideological concessions to them to convince them to join them. But at the same time, also, we need to put the Islamists, whether in Egypt or Tunis, in the broader context of the difference between Egypt as a state and between and society and Tunis as well. So, for instance, the role of the army, as Noureddine mentioned, is definitely the army in Egypt is very entrenched in politics since 1952 until now, and they have a lot of stakes within politics. And of course, economic privilege that they will not leave it easily to any civilian government. And if you follow the debate right now within the 50-member committee that amended the constitution, that one of the most ironic things that the immunity of the army is one of, I would say, the common issue between different forces. So there is no much debate, there is no much dispute over the immunity of the military, which is something ironic. They dispute everything else. But when it comes to the military, they agree on to give some immunity for the military. The third point is that also the position of the secular and liberal forces between both countries, which I would say, Noureddine mentioned that the civil society in Tunis is divided. I would say even it is more divisive in Egypt. And some of them, they are co-opted by the state. The majority of secular and liberal forces in Egypt, they are, I would say, immature. And it's also ironic that many of them now, they are calling for General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to take over and to run for presidency, which is ironic. Why? Because instead of trying to create an alternative for Islamists, indeed, which is now, there is a huge vacuum now in Egypt, and instead of trying to build a social network and reach out to society, they, as a very weak student that instead of studying, trying to get help from his colleagues. Mm-hmm. So this is the big difference. At the same time, you can find also among civil society organizations that those who are willing to cooperate and to coordinate with the state more than dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, so you can talk about a bunch of differences between the Egyptian case and between the Tunisian case, which I would hope that in the future that these differences would move forward towards having more progressive political forces in both countries.
Thank you, Khalil. I wonder if you could also comment. Noureddine mentioned the Salafis in Tunisia. Obviously, the Salafis in Egypt played a very interesting role supporting the events that happened in June and July of this year, and perhaps trying to fill that Islamist space, but in the new, what you've called sort of phase 2 of the attempt at transition in Egypt. Could you comment a bit on what the Salafists in Egypt, what their view is, given that they are in contradiction with some of the positions of their coalition partners?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, Salafi is not monolithic thing in Egypt. They have, as of course in Tunis, they have variety of players, and we can talk about two types of Salafis mainly, those who are politicized or political Salafi in Egypt. I mean mainly Noor Party and Dawah Salafi, its patron, Al-Watan Party, which is split from Noor Party last January. And we have, of course, Al-Asala Party and Al-Fadila Party. And those parties, they are involved in politics, and they have an interest to get a space in the public sphere in order to advance their ideology and their goals. And then you have the informal Salafis, I would say, those who are not interested in getting some political power or to have a political say in what's happening in Egypt. But I'm sure that you mean, we are pointing out to those who are involved in formal politics. And I would say here you have the Noor Party on one hand, which is Noor Party, they believe that they should not confront the state or to stand against the state. And this is part of their mindset, part of their ideology, that they should tolerate the state, when it comes to repression or any kind of policies that might affect the political freedoms. And on the other hand, you have the Al-Watan Party, Al-Fadila Party, and Al-Asala Party, and they are part of what's called the anti-coup coalition in Egypt, which is operating under the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I would say the Noor Party made its calculations to back the coup and to support the military based on three main interests or main reasons. First one is that one of the main goals of the Noor Party is trying to tame the Muslim Brotherhood and try to stop their power hunger as they perceive it. And if we remember, the first party that talked about this kind of Ikhwanization of the state, brotherhoodization of the state, that the Brotherhood is trying to take over the state, came from Yunus Mekhioun, the leader of Noor Party. And he was threatening the Brotherhood that he has a list of those public offices and ministers that are run by the Muslim Brotherhood. The second point is that there is a perception among Noor Party leaders that the current crackdown against the Muslim Brotherhood would make it very difficult for them to come back to political life easily and quickly, which means that they can't take more space for themselves. And the third point is that, which in this regard, I would say they have a very understandable position, that they try to advise and to work with the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Brotherhood tended to marginalize them, which is, to a large extent, was true. The downside of this is the following. The first thing is that it's very hard to believe that Noor Party and Dawah Salafiyya would fill the vacuum of the Muslim Brotherhood. For many reasons, but one of them is that they don't have the same social network of the Muslim Brotherhood. Second, Salafi, after their position from the military over the last 3 months, they lost a lot of their credibility among Islamists. So it would be hard for them to mobilize the Islamic forces behind them in the upcoming elections. The downside of this is that it is very likely that the new constitution would ban religious parties, and this would be the counter, productive strategy of Noor Party. That now they are backing the military, but at any point in the future that they might be banned because of the new constitution. The question is the state and the military willing to sacrifice Noor Party? Because at the end of the day, the state needs some kind of legitimacy, that they have Islamic representative, whether within the Constitutional Assembly or in the political game. So what kind of deal that might happen or might come between the state and Noor Party, we need to wait and to see what would happen.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Rabab, let me turn to you. And to try to delve deeper, I mean, Egypt has gone through a very deep revolutionary moment in January of 2011, perhaps again in June of this year. Some people describe Egypt almost as in perpetual revolution. But at the same time, we seem to have a counter-revolution. We seem to have, some people call it a coup. There's so much going on socially. the forces that unleashed these uprisings are still very much obviously alive in all of the countries, but you see it very, very much in Egypt. How would you describe sort of the revolutionary dynamic today in Egypt? The young people, the not young people, the citizens, the women, the groups, the political parties, which mobilized by the millions once and twice, and perhaps some of them are still reorganizing in this new situation. And how is that really revolutionary momentum, is that still impactful in Egypt? We've seen that in both moments, the more organized political groups, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood as an organized party or the military as an organized deep state, they could take advantage of things, and yet the population is still very, very vibrant. How would you describe that dynamic and its future?
Okay. Thank you, Paul, Megan, and Kate, for having me. I'm glad that in the question, Paul, you referred to the idea that those are revolutions. And I think a lot of our frustrations and misexpectations come from the fact that we tend to think of what's going on in Egypt and elsewhere in the Arab world as democratic transitions. Mm-hmm. And hence, I find the title of the conference very interesting. For example, it's called Managing Transition and Containing Conflict. And I think this is exactly where our problem as analysts and observers arise. Because those are not transitions, those are revolutions. And the element of procedural democratic transition is only part of a bigger process of aspirations that people went out for and continue to go out, and hence the revolutionary dynamics you're talking about. Accordingly, the idea of containing conflict becomes very problematic, because conflict is many times necessary and even more often inevitable. And hence, trying to just, overcome this or look into clear models of a linear process where, we need to go from point A to B and then from point B to C, and that this is irreversible. I don't think it's true or practical or applicable to the situation in Egypt or the Arab world. And that's why the revolutionary dynamic tend to move not in a straight line, but actually in a zigzag, if you may, with ups and downs. And that's absolutely normal and should be expected. Having said that, I think in Egypt we face at least three core challenges when it comes to revolutionary dynamics. The first is, I think we have revolutions without revolutionaries. Not in any way am I trying to undermine the amazing work of many of my comrades and colleagues, activists who have been doing excellent work within the labor movement, within the human rights movement, women movement, so on and so forth. And if it wasn't for their accumulated work 10 years before 2011, we would not have seen that moment. But they remain to be dispersed individuals with no organization, with no plan, so to speak. And I think this has been leading to a very existential dilemma within the revolutionary dynamic, which is you have what I think of as tectonic shifts, the revolution. But they've been hijacked every time by a conservative, non-revolutionary, not only non-revolutionary, anti-revolutionary agent, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or the military. And this is very problematic, because whereas you have all the conditions ripe, the element of agency remains missing. But does this mean that the revolutionary momentum is over or dead? I don't think so. And here I don't think so, not because of what people like to call, youth movements and whatnot. I think those so-called movements have been very much overrated, with all due respect. I work with a number of them. But the idea that the revolution in Egypt was done by, small, middle-class young people, I think this was an image created for the media and for public consumption of the middle class. But it does not actually reflect the totality of the picture. And hence, when I look at revolutionary momentum and its continuation, I look at specific indicators. Egypt, throughout the last year, came out as the country with the highest number of labor protests. This includes strikes, sit-ins, protests, so on and so on. This is not a country that's settling anytime soon. 1. 2, despite the very fascist, and I'm using this word meaningfully, the very fascist hype against every form of dissent. And the ultra-nationalist moment that we're living through now, with the whole, we have a slogan very popular now in Egypt called "Ofrum ya Sisi," grind them, General Sisi. So, despite this, you are still finding attempts at organization outside the binary of those two anti-revolutionary forces, which is the Muslim Brotherhood and the military / Fulul, the ancien regime. Things like the revolutionary new umbrella movement called the Revolutionary Path, for example, that Ahmed Meher later on can talk about. I'm part of it. But I think it's a embryonic movement, but the fact that it can be there, it can have representations and branches in more than 8 governorates outside of Cairo, I think that's an indicator that we're still having a revolutionary momentum. The last thing, I think, is that you look at the public discourse and you completely feel, despite beyond the facade of being a completely pro-Morsi supporter or a pro-Sisi supporter, you feel the need for substance. People are talking about real life needs beyond political aspirations. Mm-hmm. So they're talking about security, they're talking about economic needs, and no way in the foreseeable future will the new regime be able to do what its predecessors did in the 50s and the 60s, which is buying off dissent by appeasing economic and material needs. So it's not materially possible, and hence they have no way of completely subduing the revolutionary momentum.
Thank you very much, Rabab. And as you say, I mean, these social and political processes are very complex, very zigzag, as it were, and will go through many iterations. But I'd like to get your view on the straight line that was drawn by the new authorities, the so-called roadmap. This is a very complex situation that there is a straight line, revise the constitution, hold a referendum and elections and so on. I'd just like your views, how much reality and hope is there, not hope, in other words, will this road proceed? What are the main difficulties and challenges? Obviously, having one major party, in a sense, out of the process is an obvious one. But also, what is perhaps the public or the active citizen approach or view of that roadmap? Because on the face of it, it seems, a reasonable way forward. And yet, as you say, it's very complex and very challenging. What are your views on this roadmap?
I think the current ruling alliance, and I call it an alliance because it's not one and the same thing, despite the fact that the overwhelming and hegemonic force in it is the military. But it still has support from some factions of so-called democratic movement. I think the current ruling alliance is repeating the exact same mistake of the Muslim Brotherhood when they are in power and SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, when they came to power right after Mubarak's disposition. And that core mistake, which I think is lethal, is their over-obsession with procedural elements as opposed to politics, substance, and delivering. And hence, again, you look at the similarities. Mohammed Morsi, the ex-president, always thought that advocating the fact that he is the first civilian elected president is enough for him. You know, it gives him sort of a carte blanche to do whatever he does. And look where did he end up. The current regime, again, thinks that because El-Sisi has this kind of support, all what you need is to just put roadblocks of a series of elections. The roadmap does not have anything but dates that are not very identified. So a range of dates for three kind of electoral processes. One, a referendum for the constitution, and then parliamentary elections and presidential elections. And that's all well and good, but the roadmap did not answer many of the questions and the frustrations that led Egyptians to go down on 30th of June against Mohammed Morsi. It did not address anything about transitional justice. What will you do? How will you bring people who have blood on their hands to be accountable for what they did? How will you make sure that the atrocities under Mubarak, SCAF, and Morsi will not be, which frustrated people and led them to the streets, will not be repeated? How will you make sure that issues of economic distribution that again led Egyptians to go out on the street since 2011 will be addressed? The roadmap does not answer any of those questions, and hence that's why I think it's going to fail in delivering the ultimate end of it, even if it upholds the elections. So granted, yes, you can have the elections and get, elected officials. But will this bring about stability? No. Will this bring about governability? The ability of those in power to actually govern society? Absolutely not.
Excellent point. So the roadmap might happen, but without any significant outcomes. I'm going to turn finally to Larry and ask him a number of questions about what we've heard and his views as well. But before doing so, after Dr. Diamond's intervention, I will be turning to the audience for their questions. So, if you have questions in mind, prepare them as it were. And there are two microphones here. We will get to that after we hear from Larry. Of course, Professor Diamond, you've studied, revolutions. Again, I will call them transitions at this point, just attempts at moving towards more participatory and accountable forms of government. You followed, obviously, what's been happening in the Arab world very closely and written about it a lot. I wish you would, share with us some of your views about how you see these changes taking place. Where do you see them going? In light of how you've seen things of a similar nature take place in other parts of the world, perhaps in other phases of recent history.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Middle East Institute, for the opportunity to participate again in this wonderful conference. I agree with actually most of what's been said, including the analysis of Professor El Mahdi about where Egypt is today, an extremely superficial, manipulated, and I think we have to say cynical exercise that's being unfolded now and presented as a transition. So whatever our hopes were, whatever our enthusiasms and imaginations were in the early heady days of what we've called the Arab Spring, say after the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt in January and February of 2011, I think it's now, and then the toppling of President Saleh in Yemen and in a different way of Muammar al-Gaddafi, I think it's now clear, Paul, this is going to be a long process. It's not one that is going to be completed in a year, probably not in a few years. I think what you've heard Professor al-Mahdi say, Khalil al-Anani say about Egypt is, we're not going to see the emergence of democracy in the next few years, though certainly the military, again for its own cynical reasons, seeking domestic and international legitimacy, is going to present it as such. And neither are we going to see the society say, okay, we failed. We'll take a competitive authoritarian regime and just give us bread and we'll be happy. First of all, the regime is not going to have the legitimacy or the economic model, the ability to knit together the society, the ability to address the fundamental grievances of labor and other actors that would create a more organic stability, a kind of societal consensus that would enable the fundamental economics and social grievances to be addressed. And keep in mind, it's just one thing I'd like to tweak about what you said. There's just no hope of addressing the massively deferred economic and social agenda of Egyptians who have gotten the short end of the stick for decades and really been, I'd use the word virtually exploited by generations of leaders and by the architecture of power. There is just no hope of addressing this unless economic growth can be generated again in Egypt. And that goes for Tunisia as well. If we don't get growth, if we don't get investment, if we don't get job generation, there will be no sustainability to whatever passes as a transition. And in Tunisia, in, I think, sharp contrast to Egypt, and frankly, in sharp contrast to everywhere else in the region, certainly to Yemen, I fear to Libya, and so on. I mean, Tunisia at least has a chance to complete a certain phase of a transitional process that would produce a constitutional political system that we could, analytically, with a degree of integrity and accuracy, recognize as an electoral democracy. It's the only Arab Spring country that has, in the near term, I think, a chance to produce that outcome. But it's going to require the production of much more consensus than now exists, the ability to negotiate and compromise among key political actors. And here I think, Paul, one wants to be cautious about drawing any analogies, because every time you draw an analogy, all of the obvious ways in which the analogy is ridiculous will be noted. But I will note this element of an analogy that I do think can be drawn between the Tunisian situation and the South African situation. The South African situation, obviously as well, in the early 1990s, after the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of the ANC, was deeply polarized. And it's easy to forget how close it came to being derailed and how pessimistic and deeply worried people were in South Africa while this was unfolding. I remember the assassination of the South African Communist Party leader and a very important African political leader of the resistance movement, Chris Hani. I'm not in any way comparing Chris Hani to Chokri Belaid, for example, but there was a similar sense of betrayal, of understandings that had been made, of blame being cast, of implicit threats that this, everything was off the table if this is the way that politics was going to be done. And one thing that I'd say helped to rescue the transition and push it forward was a relationship that developed of a certain degree of trust and mutual respect and ability to work through this on the part of Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. At least Rashid Ghannouchi and Mr. Essebsi have met now and talked to one another. That hadn't happened when I was in Tunisia a year ago, and we tried to get them together at least in a conference in March earlier this year. They came together in one room. At least that was the start. But there isn't anything like that level of trust and ability to sit down and really work through the situation and be unlikely partners for peace and transformation that Mandela and de Klerk were. Now, is it about personalities? Is it about deeper structural forces? It's hard to say, but I think personalities and leadership really do matter in these transitions, and individuals like those two, I think, will have an outsized influence on the transition. I think it may have been Khalil al-Anani who said there's no one in the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt like Rashid al-Ghannouchi. I find it very hard to pass judgment on the ultimate intentions or sincerity of particular actors. But I find Rashid al-Ghannouchi an extremely distinctive, if not unique across these countries, an intriguing and hopeful person. It could be that after all those years in London, maybe he's just, this is one theory, extremely sophisticated about what needs to be said and projected to the West and to more moderate and secular elements in his own country. Or it could be that he's really a much more patient and flexible person. But I do think that engagement needs to happen. And if you look at the South African transition, if you look at the Portuguese Revolution and how frequently it looked like it was going to fail, go off the rails, be seized by radical forces or so on, Tunisia does stand out as being within the realm of transitions that face difficulties, that face crises, faced repeated moments when there was deadlock or when it looked like it just was going to not work, and when in the end it was rescued. And so I think it's important that we not be too cynical and too despairing about the transition in Tunisia. And I'll say what I've said repeatedly almost from the beginning as a comparativist who's kind of trying to engage and understand this region. One of the big problems that confronts the effort to build democracy in the Arab world is that there is no democracy in the Arab world. That sounds tautological, but you know the sense in which I mean it, that it's what's called in the literature a bad neighborhood. And so there are no models, no points of diffusion. And so if you're thinking strategically, and believe me, I think we need to in a perspective of 10 to 20 years, not 2 to 3 years, about how democratic change can come to the Arab world, I just think it is overwhelmingly important to get reasonably soon one success story, one country that shows, well, with moderation, with compromise, negotiation, it won't be perfect. There need to be constitutional amendments along the way. Radicals and spoilers will try and sabotage this, kill people, create events. Terrorists will mobilize, as they have recently. but with enough goodwill, partnership, compromises, a reasonably viable transition can roll forward, a democracy can emerge, the center can be found, and gradually a democratic bargain can begin to work to produce acceptable levels of what Professor Al-Mahdi was talking about. That is social justice, economic inclusion, incorporation, regeneration of economic growth, compromise, and so on. And just to conclude this response to what you posed, there's just nothing like that in Egypt right now. Unfortunately, the analogies that you summon, one I think should summon up to the Egyptian situation now, or to other countries where the military has been firmly in control and has been trying to manage a transitional process that will not alter the fundamental structures or relations of political and economic power. So you kind of meddle with the facade on top and hope the United States will buy it, Europe will buy it, the society will buy it, and at a minimum you buy time, because there's certainly no evidence that the Egyptian military has any kind of viable, sustainable, long-term strategy, not only for saving its own interests, because if you can't produce a more just society, if you can't respond to the fundamental economic and political grievances of the people who've been out in the streets pushing these revolutions, how sustainable is their position going to be over the medium run of the next, say, 5-8 years? Eventually, people are going to figure out that the quote transition they've been given was a fraud, that the person who was elected president at the end of this process, I think it's an implication of what you were saying, is not an independent actor with the power to do very much. And while I think it's clear the military strategy, General al-Sisi's strategy, looks like it's going to be find somebody out there who's acceptable to them to be president, make them take the responsibility for this in the way that one prime minister after another in Morocco or Jordan has to take responsibility and then is dispensable and the monarchy is saved. And just tread water in this way. Well, Egypt's in a lot worse shape now, much more dire straits, with much more, I think we can use the word, if you look at the trends historically through this decade, revolutionary pressure than Jordan or Morocco have been in, and we know what direction they are headed in. So they're not going to be able to tread water for very long, and if the generals think that they can just throw up a president who they'll be able to constrain and, quote, influence, and then when he fails to really revive the economy, because how is he going to get foreign investment when there's no genuine consensus, when the strategy is going to be shut out the Muslim Brotherhood, arrest any critic who ridicules the regime, arrest the usual suspects and cycle them in and out, terrorize them and shut them up. That's not the kind of consensus that is going to restore the one indispensable, I'd say, requirement for economic revival in both of these countries, which is a true, not a fake, political legitimacy. And I don't see how Egypt is going to recover or regenerate anew, because I think it's been lacking for a long time, political legitimacy that will build confidence, that will unlock domestic investment, that will attract foreign investment without a real social and political bargain with this society. And in the absence of that, how long is the Gulf going to be able to just shovel rents to them to keep the Egyptian economy, the nose of the Egyptian economy, barely above water? I think this is not a sustainable project either.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. Very rich, not very hopeful picture, but a very rich one.
I'm more hopeful about Tunisia than you think.
Yeah.
I'm just not hopeful about Egypt.
Maybe one policy takeaway is extended exile in London is a good idea. It seems to be one of the hopeful points. But really, I want to thank all of the panelists for a very condensed, very, very rich insights and analyses and comments on what they see going on in these countries. I want to turn now to you, to the audience, for questions. Please make them brief. We'll take a few questions. As I said, there's a microphone there and a microphone there. So go ahead and line up behind these microphones, and I'll take them in a zigzag fashion, as is the moment we're living through. Sir, on the left. And you could introduce yourself, please, and pose your question. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Daniel Liss. I'm with the U.S. State Department. I'd like to thank the panel for such an insightful discussion this morning. I'd like to pose my question to Dr. Diamond. Obviously, a major strain in the literature on democratization is the tie between economic growth or economic preconditions to successful democratization. You alluded a lot to the need for economic growth in Egypt in particular for there to be a successful transition. And you mentioned in your remarks that there has to be some sort of societal consensus towards what is necessary for economic growth, towards distribution of wealth, about the way forward towards job creation, for there to be economic growth. And I'm curious where you think this consensus can come from, because you would think that it would come from a political bargain or some sort of that the consensus on what is necessary for economic growth would come from a political discussion. But if economic growth is almost a precondition for democratization, how do you begin the political discussion and try and get consensus about that? And just to give one example of what I'm talking about, I went to a talk last week, another panel discussion on Egypt, and there was a Muslim Brotherhood elected official actually who had been obviously thrown out of parliament, or the parliament was dissolved, and then there was a Salafist. And both spoke about how they were on the ground in their communities, in their rural communities in Egypt, actually helping farmers plant better crops, and so on. And they said, the elite in Cairo that largely shored up Mubarak's government for so many decades, they don't care about these people. They're not on the ground. They talk, but they don't actually get on the ground and help the farmers and try and actually develop the communities and pave the roads. And so where does this consensus come from?
Thank you for that question. To the right here.
Hi, I'd like first to thank all the panelists for a very engaging conversation. I was wondering, actually, I think
please introduce yourself.
Nadia Awaidat, Oxford University. And I think my question is most relevant to Dr. Anani and Dr. Mahdi. And it's regarding social media. There was no mention of social media. And I think I see the citizen engagement that you spoke about, Paul, at the beginning, that is most vibrant and most alive and critical. You see all the values that I imagine the youth of the Middle East are aspiring to root really in the social media, in the free, Facebook pages that are starting every day to raise issues that are historical, Islamic, social, political. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, my name is Dan Kohansky. I'm with the State Department on my way to Morocco, and I'd like to thank the panel and the Middle East Institute. And I want to focus somewhat on Dr. Jebnoune's distinction between traditional Islamists and non-Islamists, in the sense that there's an understanding that traditional Islam has never been very comfortable with or eager to work with nation state. It doesn't deal with the concept of modern nation state. And you've all separated Tunisia and Egypt particularly, and also Libya. So I'm wondering if you would generally address the question of how this view of antipathy toward the nation state can impact the development of economic growth and democracy that you're all trying to foster here.
Thank you, sir. Please.
I'm Stephen Buck. I was former office director for Egypt and North Africa at the State Department. This is similar to the other question, just a little bit slightly different. How do you see a path for the military to keep some of their economic assets, whatever percent of the gross national product that is, and the crony capitalism, and at the same time expand that. Because unless you expand unless you expand the participation, it won't work. So how do you see a way of doing that? Is there a way? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to our panelists and in reverse order. And I'd like to add also a couple of questions. To Professor Diamond, if you'd share with us a bit more. I know there's no exact analogies or comparisons, but the issue of the military and the state and then empowerment of citizens. I mean, in the history of states, some states began as armies, which then established a state, which ended up with a citizenry, which became empowered, and they had to deal with it. Some states have militaries which are not as dominant, and you look all over the world, whether it's in Southern Europe or Pakistan or Latin America or Asia, how the militaries, who used to be the state effectively, adjusted with great difficulty to the power shift that effectively takes place. What we have is a power shift. The people are now empowered. They will no longer be disempowered. What thoughts can we see from other parts of the world? And to Dr. Jebnoun, a question. I mean, in the Tunisian example, Nahda was a bit inclusive. It, had allies. It's also in a dialogue. It's not going very well, perhaps, but they've accepted sort of the principle of power sharing. And yet you've indicated that it really is a struggle, between the two, in a sense, either me or you, sort of between the winner takes all and the real power sharing, the acceptance of power sharing. In Egypt, it's clear, kind of a winner take all situation. But in Tunisia, how much is that inclusive, that acceptance of sharing power permanently to some degree? Is that part of discussion or not? So let's start with Professor Diamond, then Dr. Mahdi, Dr. Anani, and Dr. Jebnoun. Larry.
Okay, I can answer your question by also answering the question that the last questioner asked, and I can put it this way. What is needed in Egypt, I think, as a start, this will sound like circular reasoning or obvious, but if you take it seriously, I think there's a logic to it, is to get the military out of political power, and in more than a superficial way. So one can imagine, and this is the way these things happen, it is the way it happened in Latin America. If you ask the question, what was the path to getting the military out of economic and political power, to redefining their role? The path generally starts with shrinking back the political power of the military, okay? Because there's a logical sequence here. As long as they have diffuse and decisive political veto power, not to mention being the government itself, you're not going to be able to achieve much else. And Alfred Stapon and others in the literature on civil-military relations, I think, have come to some very smart and durable conclusions about how to do this. And still, the single best work on the subject, in my view, which is keyed to his study of Latin America, and particularly the Brazilian transition, is Alfred Stapon's book from about 25 years ago, Rethinking Military Politics. But the point is, civilians need to have a strategy, a politically led strategy for gradually implementing democratic civilian control over the military. And there's a logical sequence to it. The first step is to get the military out of ruling. And then you have to negotiate a bargain with them. Really, these transitions the conflict is so deep and so pervasive that unless there can be negotiated a variety of pretty serious and robust political pacts or understandings between different types of actors, it's going to be very hard to move forward. So one type of pact that is needed in Egypt is between the military and broadly civilian political actors, that the military is going to withdraw from the political arena and really let politics happen. And in return, they can keep all their toys, they can keep all their economic assets, they can maintain control over their decision-making and budgets and so on, and that'll be the agreement. They have their sphere, and politics has its sphere of autonomy. But obviously that is an extremely low-quality democracy and one that is not a stable equilibrium or should be acceptable for a long time. So then, as democracy gains its footing, you begin to chip away at that, and legislation is passed that kind of reins it in and rolls back the degree of military's economic monopoly power, subjects military budgets to more scrutiny. You begin to stand up a parliament that has expertise because you're training parliamentary staff in military budgeting, weapons acquisitions, and so on. You begin to educate new generations of Egyptian military officers in the academy. Over time, the power balance changes further. You modify the curriculum. You keep moving in a direction of democrat, but it's got to be a generational project where you've got a situation like Egypt. It's just not going to happen overnight. If you don't have strong civilian political institutions that are sinking roots and developing their own legitimacy, then they're not going to have the power to do this. But you're never going to get to that point unless you can push the military really out of politics. And this has been the dilemma of Pakistan as well. The problem is, who's the military going to negotiate with? If the civilian actors in Egypt could form at least a tactical coalition that would bridge their differences and say, okay, at least on these issues, we're going to collaborate to try and get a deal with the military that will give them right now what they want, which is the preservation and protection of a lot of their informal power, in particular their economic wealth and power. Let's do that, and then we can argue about other things over time. But the field of Egyptian political actors is so divided, in part because the military has been, I think, quite brilliant at dividing them. That's been a major element of its project, that you can't get to that point. So it becomes very, very circular. Just a response to the first question that was asked here about, I don't think there actually are economic preconditions for transition. I may have been misunderstood. I don't think there are any conditions for a political transition away from authoritarian rule to democracy, except a commitment, a realization on the part of the society and hopefully a share of the political elite, so it doesn't have to be bloody and revolutionary, that political change has to happen for whatever reason. Then once you push that through, there are conditions for the transition taking root and being successful. And certainly economic growth is one. And that's when you start getting the issues of sustainability. So what the real question is, how can economic growth be generated so that if a political transition were to happen in Egypt to something that at least kind of looks like democracy and is not a total sham and facade, then what could be done to generate economic growth so that people would see this as a legitimate political system and it would have the chance to breathe and develop its footing over the years to come. And there, I think a number of things would be necessary, certainly intelligent economic policies that don't rely so heavily on subsidies or whatnot that they're unsustainable. There'd have to be probably a political pact as well. This is a frequent element of a political pact that forges some agreement on near-term economic policies as well. And you'd probably need a lot of economic assistance if you're going to deal with the subsidies issue to cushion the blow of what's going to happen to ordinary people when the subsidies start to be withdrawn, so that it'd be much better for Egypt if the implicit subsidy of poor people's incomes that are coming through control, for example, of bread prices, were just given to them in cash as an income subsidy. And we actually have technologies now to do this so that poor people's income levels, with the removal of food and fuel subsidies and so on, actually would not be altered. They might even be better off, but maybe they'd have a cell phone, and every month there'd be a genuine mobile banking system in Egypt, and every month there'd be a cash deposit to their account, and they'd be getting more money through that income supplement that they're getting from these subsidies. But you really need some degree of political consensus on a few key policy initiatives in order to bring that about.
Thank you very much, Larry. Dr. Mahdi, any responses to the questions?
Oh, yeah. On the social media thing, I think the whole hype about social media is overrated. Revolutions do not happen virtually. Revolutions happen with real people on the ground. Yes, social media has been used as part of the communication tool, not necessarily the mobilization, but it takes much more than social media. And I think that has been very clear over the past 2.5 years. A number of times, big social media gurus have called for protests and no one showed up. I'll leave it to Khalil to disagree with me or agree and elaborate. I'll just make quick comments that will seem contradictory about the whole military issue. I don't think they're contradictory. I think they reflect the complexity of the situation. So, one, as long as the military maintains its economic assets, it has the resources, it has the weapons, it has no reason to yield the political veto in clear intervention. It's not even veto power, but clear intervention in Egyptian politics. I think the situation in Egypt is so grave. I mean, we have a military that comes out publicly and announces that it's going to lend the Egyptian state, the national budget, $1 billion. I mean, that's not the low-quality democracy that Larry was talking about. That's beyond the idea of modern nation-state altogether. It becomes a parallel state. So I think it's much grave than just allowing it to let go and whatnot. Two, I think that unfortunately, again, we know from the literature that there are moments whereby the idea of circumventing military power over politics and developing civilian control, there are moments that are more conducive. One of those moments in Egypt has been with the election of the so-called civilian president. This kind of legitimacy that Mohammed Morsi had by being, historically speaking, the first elected president. Unfortunately, he and the Muslim Brotherhood gladly wasted and did not try to start this gradual path over pulling out the military from politics and minimizing their economic turf. The third and final thing, I think in Egypt and the Arab world, it's very different than Brazil and other countries that underwent military dictatorships, because the element of the very much alive post-coloniality, the presence of Israel, the American invasion of Iraq, all those things make it very clear in the public mind and collective consciousness that somewhere, somehow, the military is the sort of national savior of sorts, or the hero or the protector. And accordingly, it becomes very easy to attack anyone that criticizes the military or their turf or whatnot, and to use, and I think Americans are familiar with this, and to use the discourse of national interest and the threat against the nation and the people and our values, and the military, in the case of Egypt, being the only grantor, protector of this. So that makes sense.
Thank you, Rabab. Khalil?
Well, I will add just a few things to what Rabab mentioned about the question of Nadia, about the social media. And I totally agree with Rabab that we should not whether exaggerate or underestimate the role of the social media in the Arab Spring. We all remember one of the key elements in the Egyptian revolution came through the Khalid Said Facebook page, if you remember, when they called for this gathering on the 25th of January, the police date, or the police day. So no one can underestimate the role of the social media. At the same time, we shouldn't overrate the social media. I think one of the main challenges that when it comes to social media is how to materialize social media into more political action and revolutionary action, I would say. This is one of the main issues. And I think what's happening now in Egypt is that the military and the state is trying to even close the last window, which is the social media networks, mainly Facebook and Twitter, try to close them and put restrictions on them because they think that they can create many problems in the future. So one of the main articles in what's proposed now, the terrorist law in Egypt, is try to put some kind of supervision and surveillance over social networks. And so anyone might criticize the army or the state on Facebook, he might get detained or something like this. So the question is, how can social activists or social media activists can move a bit from this virtual kind of sphere into the reality and try to take action on the ground. The second issue of, I think, Steve's question about how to guarantee the economic privilege and interests of the military. I don't think this is the main concern in Egypt. I think, as Rabab mentioned, it's about how to prevent the military from subverting and from destroying what we thought the growing political system that came out from 25th of January revolution. I think the challenge now is, and this something happened after or post 30th of June demonstration, is how to dismantle the cemented alliance between the army and police. That's one of the many challenges now, that the army over the last 3 decades, to a large extent, did not involve in everyday politics. They did not use force or live ammunition against protesters. What's happened over the last 3 months, I would say, that the military heavily involved in gunning down many protesters. And this is something that would run against the picture and the image of the army as the savior of Egyptian nation. And it can be counterproductive, I would say, in the future. So I think this is another challenge that would be added to the challenges that are facing Egypt now, has to dismantle the relationship between the army on the one hand and the police on the other hand. And I think this is the last point.
Thank you, Khalil. Dr. Noureddine.
One word on Egypt. I think we cannot move towards kind of democratization without redefining, reshaping the civil-military relations. When you have a Minister of Defense who is a Lieutenant General and who is uniformed one, we cannot expect any transition or any democratization. Those are my opinions, and we can talk about them later. I want to answer to your question about the traditional Islamist within the Tunisian context. So within the Salafist spectrum, we have at least 4 or 5 parties or movements: the Islah Party, the Reform Party, the Authenticity Party, the Mercy Party. Those 3 parties recognize the legitimacy of the Tunisian nation state. On the other side, we have what we call Hizb al-Tahrir, or the Liberation Party, which was created in 1953 in Jerusalem by Taqiyuddin Nabhani, and this is one of the branches of this party in Tunisia, believes on a system of khilafah and doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the nation state, of the Tunisian state, although using the democratic game just to achieve its goals. We have another association called the Centrist Association of Awareness and Reform. This is a Salafist movement involved at the social level. And of course, we have Ansar Sharia, which not all of them are jihadists, but within the Ansar Sharia, we have, I will say, a compound which believe on the violence. Within Nahda is, I think, split within three main or major trends. We have Ghannouchi, who is, I think, pragmatic. We have Mr. Muru, who is, I will say, has a little bit conciliatory approach towards the other political actors in Tunisia. And we have a more conservative wing led by Monsef Chourou, who was jailed under Ben Ali for 21 years. And it's understandable his behavior as he thinks that the others means what we call the non-Islamist. We cannot trust them. The same behavior from the non-Islamists. They don't trust the Islamist. The problem when Ghannouchi came back from Londonistan, just when he came back, they started the Islamist movement, and mainly Nahda started manipulating the issue of identity, as the Muslim Brotherhood did it in Egypt, whether Tunisians are Phoenicians, Berbers, Arabs, Muslims, they are Tunisian. The most important thing for the Tunisian is their Tunisianness. This is the most important thing. They're proud about that. This is a concept that was nurtured under the monarchy since 1705 until 1957, and then developed and nurtured under Bourguiba. So the Islamists in Tunisia, they have to understand that people are not against them. People will accept the results coming from the ballots, but they have also to play. They have also to accept and play the game. As you said about the inclusiveness, we have a crisis of confidence between the non-Islamists and the Islamists in Tunisia. The Nahda still operating with what I call the mindset of surrounded fortress. When you are oppressed for more than 20 years, you don't trust your interlocutor. And the most important thing today is how to build this confidence between the Islamists and the others.
Thank you very much. Certainly, I'd like to thank all the panelists for this very rich, very perhaps a bit disheartening, but certainly very realistic view of the situation in these two countries. Obviously, Libya and Yemen have their own problems, in some cases larger, to say nothing of Syria, which we will also discuss in the second panel. We will have a 15-minute break, and the panel after this begins at 12:45. But please join me in thanking our panelists today.